Welcome to the Select Star Podcast, your resource for innovative technology, developer topics, and more. Here's your host, Margo McCabe from the HarperDB team.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Select Star Podcast, and thank you again for tuning in. Today, we are speaking with Max Howell, who is the CEO at tea.xyz, which we will learn a bit about today. So thank you, Max, for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And where are you calling in from today?
Actually, I live North Carolina in the Triangle area, despite my accent. I've been an American in the States for 11 years.
Okay. Nice. And where are you originally from?
I grew up South London,
Okay.
England. I have to say England because I've discovered there's 17 Londons since leaving.
I assume people still think of the main one, but who knows?
Almost certainly.
Yeah. So yeah, before we get started, would love to just hear a little bit about you, sort of your background and journey and what you're working on now.
Oh, sure. So I did a chemistry degree
Nice.
back in the time when I was at school, like high school. I remember not being 100% sure what I wanted to do with my life, but there was a career fair where I went around the room and talked to everybody, and the people I was least impressed with were the developers, the programmers. I came away thinking that they were incredibly geeky, too geeky, even though it appealed. You know, I felt the draw. And I'd been programming as a hobby up until that point. My dad taught me when I was 6 with we had this computer which the BBC, the Broadcasting Corporation, would provide, called the BBC Micro, and it booted straight into a programming language, BBC Basic. So it was incredibly easy to get started with it. I often feel that it's something which is kind of lacking, honestly, nowadays with computers and how people learn to program. Like it was kind of in your face back in the day. This was, the early 90s,
Right.
late 80s. And so I've been doing it as like a hobby, and in fact, like it was a hobby that I did a lot. Like I remember there was a few years where I'd go to the library every lunch at school in order to program. There was a bunch of us, and we competed to like make cool programs and games and things. So yeah, like, I wasn't impressed with the developers. I was a teenager. I was influenced by what it would look like to be a programmer. So I did my chemistry degree and did all right, got a job, and I was about 3 months into the job when I realized that I hated it and that I couldn't imagine spending my life doing this. It was quite different to academic chemistry. I was using this one machine, and I realized that I would be using that machine for like the next 10 years in order to like advance my career to the next step. I was looking at all the people who've been there for 40 years, and like they spent 10 years on each of these different machines working their way up. I was like, oh my God. So I sort of got depressed, quit, moved back in with my parents, and discovered Linux and open source. And started hacking on some apps and things. And the apps I was working on managed to get the attention of the startup in London, fortunately, called Last.fm, who invited me to work with them basically without really, like, they invited me for interview, but there was wasn't an interview, like
It was just
like
a job offer.
Yeah, exactly. Really lucky, and that's how it worked out for me. So I moved to London. I was slightly outside of London at the point, and started working there. And I didn't never have the correct qualifications or anything, but I managed to get the hang of it. And the process of working there, I created this tool called Homebrew, and Homebrew is, like, today used by 50, 60 million people, probably more, honestly. Certainly, the amount of instances of it running is insane, considering the amount of automation that uses it as well. but this was 2009, and it was a tool I needed to do the job I was doing there. And so I made it, and like because I came from an open source background in programming, like I immediately open sourced it. It just made sense to me. That's how it worked. Things were more like that back then as well, admittedly.
Right.
So yeah, and so I open sourced it, and about 6 to 9 months after I open sourced it, it picked up a lot of steam, and yeah, over the years, it just became this indispensable tool that it's rare now that you'll meet a developer that doesn't use it, honestly.
Yeah, that's awesome. And how do you think the tool picked up so much traction? I mean, were you talking about it a lot? Like, were you purposely trying to promote it, or was it just very organic with people just being like, oh, this is really useful, and just kind of word of mouth?
So open source is unique in that usually there isn't any opportunity for really evangelizing your own open source that you're making, because you're spending your time working on that open source, but also you're spending your time on a paid job. So I used to say that I had two full-time jobs, because I had
Right.
my paid job, and then I had maintaining Homebrew, which easily was 10,000 hours of work over the years. So you don't have time to evangelize it particularly, but I did do a couple of very key pieces of evangelism during those early months where nobody knew about it. I replied to Simon Willison's tweet. Simon Willison's still a fairly influential tech blogger and tweeter.
Yeah.
He appealed for someone to help him install some software on his Mac. And so I replied, it wasn't Stack Overflow, it was superuser.com, which is, the Stack Overflow for not, for people using computers in theory. Like there's too many different Stack Overflows in my opinion, but it was, one of the others. And I wrote this really detailed response. And I don't know for sure if that was an influential moment or not, but I think so, because it got a small amount of attention, and before that it was mostly unknown project. And about a couple of weeks after that, this guy who worked for 37 Signals, and they made Ruby on Rails, tweeted that he was going to install the new version of macOS that was coming out very soon. It was Leopard, I think, 10.5. And he was going to use Homebrew, not MacPorts, which was the big competitor at the time. MacPorts still exists. Just wasn't very. I hate saying it, but it wasn't great, which is why I made Homebrew, right? Like, and so a lot of people felt that. But also, it was really good timing. Like the Mac was just becoming the choice of platform for developers. Like, it's hard to believe now, because it's rare that you meet a developer that doesn't use a Mac, and if they don't, it'll be Linux and probably not Windows. And it wasn't that long ago that Windows was the only platform that anyone used. So Mac was becoming popular, and so there wasn't great tooling there for it yet. And here I was making something that people felt was great. And I wrote it in Ruby, and Ruby was becoming popular as well because of Ruby on Rails, right? So a lot of Ruby people like jumped in with both feet because they saw this opportunity to get the tooling that they needed in the language that they liked so much. And also, I kind of gamified it in that GitHub was extremely new. Like I think GitHub had only been on the internet for maybe 18 months at that point. And fortunately, we'd started using GitHub very quickly at Last.fm, so I was familiar with it. And it's hard to imagine now, but before GitHub, coding was way less social, I guess is the way to say it. Like there wasn't good Web 2 style tooling on the internet that facilitated that collaboration. And the people who made GitHub really understood the possibilities of using Git, even though everyone, just yesterday I read a tweet thread about how Git is awful. And, like it is, right? But it enabled workflows that just weren't possible before that, and the GitHub people really understood how to make the most of that. And Homebrew was probably the first project that really monopolized that. I had just such a seamless way for people to get involved with the project, to contribute to the project, to participate in the project using GitHub and your local clone, that it made this really enormous viral loop of passionate contribution. Like Homebrew is one of the biggest open source projects that's ever existed, and I'd be surprised if there's a bigger project in terms of how many unique contributors there's been.
Right.
And it's because it was gamified in the correct sense, and it made a massive impact at that point.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously quite the accomplishment, and something that is so interesting to hear about and to speak with creators like you. I'm sure that a lot of people in the community are very thankful for what you've created and all the contributions. But I'm curious how that, like, what's the other side of that? You've already touched on it a little bit about how, you know, you don't get paid for that. And I know you've talked before about like how the open source world in a way, how sometimes tech giants in a way can exploit these open source developers. Do you feel that there was like a missed opportunity here with such an amazing tool that you created by making it open source and not being able to make money off of it? Or do you appreciate kind of the experience it gives you? And, you know, it definitely helps your resume and just like boosts your, accountability when people are maybe looking at what you're doing now. But just curious your thoughts around that.
Yeah, well, these are good questions. So like at the time, the idea of there being a way to make money with open source was extremely foreign, at least to me. I think it was to most people who worked in tech and did open source. You know, programming wasn't as lucrative profession, especially in Britain. It certainly wasn't cool. Like, it only became cool once the iPhone came out.
Yeah.
And then everyone was like wanting to make an app.
Right.
You know, that the iPhone really changed the whole landscape for all of us. And part of the reason Homebrew became like even more successful was just this influx of people wanting to dev. But yeah, like the idea was difficult. The first time I heard of someone trying to make money with open source was NPM, which you know, obviously is huge nowadays, even bigger than Homebrew. But well, is it? Because you need Homebrew to install NPM. So, and they figured out a way to monetize it, and then like a month later, I had a call come in from a VC who was like, "Can we do something like this with Homebrew?" And I was like, "I think it's too late." And it was honestly my impression at that point, because Homebrew at that point was already so dependent on the community that had evolved and turned up. And these were just like volunteers all over the place. And I didn't see a way that we could make a business model out of it without screwing the community. And the community was the most important part. Like NPM did it quicker, I think. But I don't know, with hindsight, maybe you could have. Like, so it's not as though it didn't do anything for me, right? Like, I definitely got jobs and career opportunities and speaking engagements, like dozens of things. Like, my career was hugely boosted by making this thing. So yeah, at the time it wasn't something you could think of. Now, commercial open source has emerged over the years, and it's interesting to watch how that works. I do kind of feel that it's not true open source, as someone who's been doing it half my life at this point. But yeah, so for me, it was I cycled between doing these full-time jobs, either contracts or interesting startups. I did a stint at Apple for a year, which was definitely a mistake. It's not in my DNA to work at such a huge company, for sure.
That's fair.
Yeah, like it works for some people, but yeah, there's lots of stories I could tell about working there. But yeah, so I'd cycle between them because I wanted to work on open source. So I quit last time to work on Homebrew, and then ran out of money and then found another job. And this was something that I did a lot. And in the end, I burned out. Slash, brew was exactly what I intended to create, and I didn't see what else there was to do with it, so I wanted to move on to other things. And that was like 2015 or so. But yeah, like in the years since, always been trying to figure out how I can work on open source full time. It's just it's what I like to do. I
Right.
love building open free software, and I'm not like a hippie, you know, like the GNU people from back in the day. They kind of were the original open source people. They deeply believe in the freedom aspect of these things, and it's never really been what appealed to me. I like working with other people, and I like when you make something and random people show up and you just start working on these things together. I have lots of different projects and lots of different things going on, and you don't get that at companies, that
Right.
kind of collaborative spirit of people just trying to make the best possible thing, like agenda free, right? That's part of the thing I like about open source, is that you're just trying to make whatever is the best tool for the job. There's no marketing department that are demanding that like a certain feature end up in it. There's no CEO at the top who like suddenly pivots what the whole company is doing and saying that now it has to be different. You're just trying to make what's great, and if it fits, it slots into this open source tower that exists and has existed for 20, 30 years at this point. Just these little bits of software that become indispensable and key, and then stack up, like hold the whole thing up. And since I made Homebrew, that has become what the internet is built of. But before that, it wasn't always open source, but we found in this Web 2 transition that you can build on these really sometimes flaky, but often super mature and very specialized, but very good battle tested pieces of software. And then you save all this money and time, and you get the benefit of something that's been used by millions that also, if it's broken, you can fix.
Right.
And yeah, like that happened gradually. And so now we have all this open source that holds the entire internet and the software industry up, and yet still no one gets paid for this maintenance. And I think the fact that it was a gradual transition is why it caught most of us who maintain these pieces of software that keep it running a bit by surprise. And now we have all these companies that make a lot of money using our software,
Right.
and yet they don't contribute anything. They don't help like the people who are maintaining it to survive. And yeah, it's no longer okay, I think, is the difference. Like for a while you could say it was okay. The people making the open source, they knew what they were getting themselves into to a certain extent. They're like, yeah, I just, because everyone in it was doing the same. That's no longer really the case. So yeah, I was always looking for a way to fix that for myself. And it was 18 months ago that I came up with an idea for how to do it for everybody.
Okay. That makes sense. And is that then that now that's what you're doing now? That's what you're working on?
Yeah. So I started a company called Tea, which is in many ways the spiritual successor to Homebrew. And I like the name because it's like there was this tendency to be like boastful in the industry about drink when I made Homebrew, which is part of the reason for the name.
Oh, that's interesting.
Like, I remember reading GitHub blog posts where they were sort of talking about how they had a tap on the office floor and you could go and get yourself a pint whenever you felt like it. This was day-to-day thing. And so it feels like, we've all matured, and so instead of it being about beer, it's now about tea.
It's a little more formal. I like it.
Yes.
And so how does tea work then? How does what's the process and how successful have you guys been so far?
So yeah, the concept behind tea is one I came to while looking into crypto tech. And like many in the tech industry, I was never that interested in crypto. It always seemed like it was just a place for oddness. I don't know if you've dabbled in any of this stuff or not, but
No, I think yeah, myself and a lot of the developers because I'm at a startup, HarperDB, that I've been at for over 4 years, and there's a few people that get really passionate about crypto as like a side thing, but yeah, there's been so many ups and downs. I've somewhat avoided it, I would say.
yeah, well, I was exactly the same, right? Like the people I knew who were into it were just a little bizarre in a way and their passion was kind of scary. So I had like one friend who was like super into it, and his passion was kind of scary. But I was in between work. I'd finished up a contract and I was working on some open source, and I was playing around with some ideas for maybe some like little SaaSes I could build. I was inspired by the people on Twitter who were managing to do that kind of thing. I was like, well, that suits me, right? But I wasn't really sure what I was doing, so I was looking around at it. And while I was looking, I had this sort of moment of inspiration while playing around with digital contracts about how it was using OpenSea and the NFTs on OpenSea, and the digital contract meant that when I bought an NFT off someone else, 10% of that purchase price went to the original creator, and there was no way to work around that. Right, that was the digital contract on the blockchain. It just happened automatically. The need to involve a bank or a lawyer, and nobody could work around it unless they could figure out how to hack the digital contract, but assuming the digital contract was sound. And I was just like, wow, it's awesome for a start. But I had this moment of inspiration later that day where I saw how I could put the whole package graph for all of open source on chain. And then if I could get some value to flow into that graph, it would flow through the whole thing. And that's the big problem with open source, is that there is millions and millions of projects, 50, 100 million, probably. Now, not all of them are important, but many of them are, and many of the important ones are also relatively unknown. They're deep in this stack of importance. And every now and again, we hear about one of these projects like struggling. Like last year was Log4j, this logging library for Java, and there was a massive exploit that just hit everyone. All these enterprise companies suddenly had a root exploit in their software, and the Log4j guys got a lot of abuse, honestly, and they said, okay, look, we're sorry about the bug, we'll fix it, but we're unpaid maintainers of this project. We're volunteers, basically. If we did receive funding, then we could have like made sure that there was more security, or we'd done a security audit on this project. But we don't get any funding, and they still don't, as far as I know. And recently, like the guy maintains Core.js, which is 10 billion downloads since its inception. It's insane, and
Wow.
he just rage quit. Like, this is ridiculous. I maintain some of the most important software on the internet. Like every Node app, every JavaScript app, this package is used, and he doesn't get any funding.
Right.
And that's the problem. Like, if there is any funding, it goes to the top level, the projects people know about, and not all the dependencies of the dependencies of the dependencies. And they're the ones holding everything up. But even then, funding is like a charity. You have to beg for donations. I begged for donations for 6 months or so, and it was depressing how little I could get. So we're trying to build an entirely new economy based on open source and built on code. And it's the sort of thing you can only really do with crypto by we're creating essentially a marketplace where open source projects can participate, and their value is predefined based on their immense usage. So all the speculators that crypto comes with will have this like enormous market that they can speculate upon. And people who are interested in open source will just simply understand the value of open source. It's effectively like investing in that open source. You can put your money where your mouth is. You believe in these projects and you can participate in their success, like in a monetary sense, even. Because with our protocol, which we've spent a long time now designing, because it's intricate and it's difficult and you've got to get it right. If you invest in these projects, you get rewarded as well for their success, as well as those projects. So you get to pick and choose which ones based on like how well you understand open source and where the value is in that graph. So yeah, we're very excited about what could be done there.
Yeah. No, it sounds very important and very interesting. I know that there's been several other tools I have tried to find a way to monetize some of this and find a way to get some of these creators paid. But as you said, a lot of times it ends up being like fundraising or asking for contributions or doing, it's a lot more work. Whereas this sounds like it's just going to streamline a lot of that and make it easier for all different parties to be involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Like one aspect is for sure that it has a layer of automation. So companies that do make money with their open source, I kind of sympathize with the fact that they don't pay it back, because you got 10,000, 20,000 projects you're using, right? Like, average React app is 2,000 to 3,000 dependencies. How on earth do you fund that? So we add a certain layer of automation. You use T, and T will tell you what you're using, so you can just funnel with digital contracts. Like crypto is programmable money. Funnel that money to the places where it counts, which I also hope will make it so that there's a lot more pressure from the open source community, both the developers and the consumers of it, because now it's much easier for these companies that are making money on top of this open source stack to allocate some funds in that direction. And it really doesn't have to be much. The example I always use is this other library I wrote called PromiseKit, which was this promises library for iPhone. So it was a low-level tool that was used by a lot of apps. In fact, at the peak, it was used by 100,000 apps on the iPhone App Store, including McDonald's and Netflix and Uber and all these other apps that never gave me anything, not even a free Netflix subscription or Big Mac or anything. And at the time, this was when I was trying to beg for donations on Patreon. I was like, if I can get every one of those apps to just give me $1 a year, then I can work on open source for my job. Like, it's not a great salary for a developer, but it's a start. It would mean that I could start and then maybe make some more open source, and maybe I could get some more money for it. And because there's just no way for any of those apps to even know that I was asking for donations half the time, it just couldn't happen. But yeah, so $1 for a open source project for an app, not too bad. So you got 2,000 to 3,000 dependencies in your app. That's $3,000 a year. Like, that would fund open source. Is shocking. Like it's the numbers. The numbers just work that way. So yeah, if we provide the right system, then we can fix this.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. That's awesome. And what's the status so far in, like, is the product in beta? Do you have active users, or what's the best way for people to kind of check it out?
Yeah, so there's been several phases to this project. So there's three major components. The package manager, which is the successor to Brew, spiritual successor. In many ways, a complement to Brew, at least for now. And we released that last November, and got 7,000 stars on GitHub, about 10,000 users. And the people who use it think it's great. Like, I poured every idea I had after leaving the project Brew into tea. And I think, it represents really like the pinnacle of what that kind of tool could be. And then recently we released the graphical complement, the GUI. It's an app. In many ways, it's an app store for open source. And part of the plan is to present open source as kind of like a treasure trove of an app store that nobody's seen before. And so that's just getting started, but it's already like a beautiful piece of software that has limited utility currently, but we have plans to make it so it's pretty great. Like, I've started packaging up some of the more interesting AI tooling that exists only in open source. These things usually have to wait for ages for someone to put into a website or into an app on the iPhone App Store, or for someone to spend the time to wrap it in a .app so you can download it on your Mac or Windows. And we're giving these people a place to have a marketplace already in advance of the protocol launch. And that's the third piece, which we haven't launched yet, but we are at the point where we're building it. And I think the expectation is that we'll have a testnet live in 2 to 3 months. At that point, people can start participating, although testnet means that it's not real crypto, but it's exactly the same, right? It's just a copy of the main network. Sometimes they do actually become valuable, like people for some reason start trading with the testnet coin. But that's not the point for us. The point is that it will allow people to experiment with the protocol and see how it works, and then onboard their open source projects. So that'll be coming later this year.
Okay, got it. Well, that it sounds like you've made quick progress from when this project has started already. And obviously with things like this, there will be constant improvements and feedback from the community and things like that. But it sounds like it's already, picked up traction quite quickly. And I've seen people talking about it on Twitter here and there. And so that's super exciting. Clearly you're filling a void here that's much needed. So where's the best place, for folks that are listening, if they have questions or anything, like, should they connect on Twitter, or is there a community, or where's the best place to go?
Yeah, so I go to tea.xyz, which is our domain. It has the links to everything else. GitHub is active, and like it's a great place if you want to get involved in contributing or just learn more about the project. We have a Discord as well. And of course, the Twitter and everything's linked there. So that's where I'd go.
Awesome. Well, this is really exciting. I'm excited to kind of follow this and see where it goes. And I think that for anyone listening, they're gonna be very interested to jump in and check it out. I've had, several folks on the podcast that talk about some of these common pains that you mentioned with open source. And it's interesting. I can see why it's a space that you want to continue to be in, because I think that's where most of the passion is. I mean, to be able to have to work on something where you're not being compensated up until now, hopefully, it's obviously these developers are very passionate, as you said, just trying to create the best thing they can create, and there's not really any other motive. And so clearly that's a really, really great space to be in, and I'm sure has made it fun to think of this idea and kind of build it out.
Yeah, well, absolutely. It really is. I'm privileged that I'm able to work in what I really find passionate now. But I had to figure out a way to raise $18 million in order to do that, and I'm trying to make it so that that is not a general requirement.
Right.
And
Exactly.
I think the people who work on open source passionately, like they want this opportunity to work on it full time, and I can only imagine what they might have been able to build if they'd had that chance all this time. And I hope that there's a new generation of developers who can choose to do open source full time instead of like getting on the career treadmill at the tech companies. Honestly, I hope that a lot of people at tech companies will quit in order to work on open source because the salary will be as good, if not better.
Yeah.
It seems an awful waste to me that so many people at some of these big tech companies spend their time like working on ad algorithms and like algorithms and crap like that. It's just not a good use of anyone's talent.
Fair enough. Well, yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it will be interesting to see how quick the change might happen, because as with anything in tech, like you look back a couple years and it can be crazy. I think that the tech industry is more willing to have rapid change than really anywhere else. So, even a year from now, it'll be interesting to see where this goes. So, yeah, I really appreciate, I know we're kind of coming up on time here, but really appreciate you taking the time to chat, Max. I think that it was awesome to hear your story, and I think anyone listening will probably want to check out Tea, because from everything you've said, it sounds like it's really fulfilling an important need. So really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm excited to see where it goes.
Right, well, thanks so much. I had a nice time.
Thanks for listening to Select Star, your resource for innovative technology and developer topics. You can find our episodes in all the usual places: Spotify, Apple, Google, RSS, and YouTube. Don't forget to rate, comment, subscribe, and share. You can learn more about HarperDB at harperdb.io.